All right, so I think we might get started just so we have enough time to ask questions at the end. Um, so hello, everyone. I know some of you, my name is Krista Hogan. I work at the NOAA Chesapeake Bay Office. Usually Elise, of course, is doing these webinars, but she was busy today, so I'm filling in. And again, this is part of the MWEE Practitioners Webinar Series. So we have one today, and then we actually just have one more next month in May. And that'll kind of end our school year series, and we'll take a break for the summer. So I'll talk about that at the end. But just a reminder that these webinar series are recorded. So we invite you to actually keep your cameras off so you aren't in those recordings. And then this platform doesn't automatically mute you. So if you could actually take this moment to make sure you are muted and just look for that microphone at the bottom middle of your screen, make sure that's like X'd out so we don't have the background noise. Trying to think if there's anything else. I think that's pretty much just the logistics of it. It'll take about 2 weeks, but we will have this webinar posted to the Chesapeake Bay Program's YouTube page, and I'll share a link to that in a little bit. But otherwise, I'm going to kick it off. So we have Liz Bandola coming to us today, and we're really excited about our presentation, talking about tools you can use with students and working with the community. And so I'm going to pass it off to her. She will, of course, take questions. So please put your questions in the chat, and we'll probably save all those questions to the very end. But otherwise, I'll kick it off to you, Liz.
Great. Thanks so much, Krista. I'm going to rearrange my screen here so I can see things. Okay. So as Krista mentioned, my name is Liz Bandola, and until about a week and a half ago, I was at the University of Maryland with the Department of Anthropology there, where I served as the coordinator for the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership, or DIP. DIP is a collaborative that's focused on building resilience to climate change on the lower eastern shore of Maryland. And so in this presentation, I'm going to be sharing with you more about DIP and how we've mobilized heritage in our work and engaged with heritage in different ways. Before I dive in, though, I wanted to give you a little more about me. So I have here on this slide that I'm an environmental anthropologist, and that often is followed by questions of what does that mean? And so what I do as a researcher is I study the role of culture, and I'm particularly interested in how culture shapes people's knowledge and their experiences with the environment, and how in turn these things influence the attitudes that people have or behaviors that they use around around environmental concerns. I'm also really interested in the role of culture in shaping people's ability to adapt to climate change. And one framework that I find particularly helpful is the framework of cultural heritage. And so I'm excited to share with you a bit more about how I think about heritage and how this could be a potentially valuable tool for facilitating more meaningful outreach and educational experiences. I have lost my notes here. Oh, no, I haven't. Sorry. So I'm gonna, in this presentation, I'm gonna first cover how I think this framework of heritage that I use in my work and how I link this to coastal resilience. And then I'm going to share with you some of my research from the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership that specifically looked at the uses of heritage within our work. And then I'm going to share with you some ideas and opportunities for how you might think about harnessing heritage in your own work for creating more meaningful engagements. And within this, I'm going to share with you a new app called Maryland My Coast that might be a great opportunity to do this. So what is heritage? I thought that in order to answer this question, I would elicit some audience participation. So if you could, in the chat box, think about or share with us what some words are that come to mind when you think about Chesapeake heritage. And as you're thinking of these words, why are these words significant to you? So I'll give maybe 30 seconds for folks to do that. I see watermen.
Yeah, that came in quick. Oysters,
Oysters.
waterfowl hunting, cultural treasures, fish. Legacy. Yeah, crabs. Native Americans. Chesapeake Bay. Way of life. Archaeology and historical sites, cultural history. Tradition. A deep connection to water, how it shapes our life. Early English landing, sense of place. Oh, keeps going on. Too quick. Identity, economics, environmental diversity, ecosystem change based on development over time.
Great. Those are it's a great list of words, and hopefully as you're thinking about why these words are significant, you got a sense for how these words are connected to our sense of identity, our sense of place, to what we value about the Chesapeake Bay. And this is really an important part of how heritage operates. So a little more of an academic definition for you. So heritage is quite different from history. Oftentimes we think of heritage as being synonymous with history, but they actually operate in quite different ways. So while history is this static, often objective narrative about the past, or at least presented in, as an objective narrative, heritage, in contrast, is very much a personal and biased interpretation of the past, and one that we often put into conversation when trying to construct meaning or identity. And these narratives are far from static. In fact, they're constantly being reworked and engaged in current and future moments of change. So as much as heritage is about the past, and as much as it draws upon the past, it's equally about the present and about the future, if not even more so. Another really important aspect of heritage is its focus on change. Heritage is all about change, and in fact, it's only activated in moments of change. So you can think about it as it's a way that we draw upon our pasts to help ground us and to hold on to a sense of ourselves when the world is changing around us. And you know, in the context of climate change, this is obviously an important tool to be able to have in your arsenal. But we can also use heritage to invoke change and to resist change. And in this way, we can understand heritage as an important cultural tool of power. So as a tool of power, heritage is also a really important part of how we build social resilience. Being socially resilient means having the capacity or the agency or the power to engage with change in ways that enables you to support your own social well-being. And you build your social resilience by increasing your access to different forms of capital. So these can be you know, financial capital or political capital, your political connections or your own political voice. It can be physical capital. Maybe you live next to a really healthy marsh or on elevated land. But it can also be cultural capital. And I'd like to propose that heritage is a really important form of cultural capital that we all lean upon. And it's one that we can, as environmental practitioners, as educators, that we can harness as a tool for creating more meaningful and inclusive spaces to empower people to be part of these conversations about environmental change or climate change. And this is particularly important to do with those who have historically been left out of these conversations. So when we use heritage in this way, it can be a really powerful tool for building social resilience or for strengthening people's capacity to adapt and successfully adapt to environmental change. The last point I want to make here is that social resilience is a necessary part of how we build resilience to things like climate change. Of course, we need things like healthy and robust marshes and other natural infrastructure to protect us from sea level rise, but we also need healthy communities that are able to carve their own climate futures in meaningful and supported ways. So when you pursue one and leave out the other, you leave half of the system quite vulnerable. So within the social sciences, we tend to use a framework, the framing of socio-ecological resilience, to more holistically support coastal systems that are undergoing change. So today I'm going to share with you some of my research on waterman heritage that I carried out as part of an initiative through the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership. And I hope that the case study I'm going to share with you is a nice demonstration of how a heritage framework can be a really valuable tool for understanding where communities are coming from, but also for understanding how to effectively engage them in these complex, sometimes contentious topics like climate change. So to orient you, Deal Island is on the lower eastern shore of Maryland. It's on right on the way to Chrisfield and Ocean City, right at when you get to Princess Anne on your way out to the beach there. It's located down this long road here it's 18 miles long. It takes you all the way out to the peninsula, the tip of the peninsula, and this is the only access point to the communities that are located out here, which you can see down here. So there are these 6 small communities, and this area here on this bottom map is what encompasses what we consider to be the Deal Island Peninsula within our partnership. And so I mentioned there are these 6 small communities, but there's also the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, which is owned and managed by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. There are about 1,000 people that live out here, and they include a mixture of born heres, or those folks that have familial roots to the area, and they also include come heres, or second homeowners and retirees who have relocated here from elsewhere, oftentimes to take advantage of more affordable waterfront property. So many of the born here families who live out here can trace their lineage back to some of them to the early settlers who established these communities in the early 18th century. Others can trace them back to waterman families that were benefiting from when this area was a thriving, prosperous, working waterman community in the late 19th century. It was one of the most productive waterman industries in the state. And today, crabbing, and to a smaller extent, oystering, remains a staple of the local economy, though to a much lesser extent than it was at its heyday. If you've been out here, you may be familiar with the local claim to fame that this is the home of the Maryland skipjack. And this is, in fact, one of the few places where you can still find a fleet of working skipjacks in the winter months. It's also locally celebrated as the birthplace of Methodism on the Eastern Shore, and I'll get more into this in a bit. So as you saw on this last slide, this is a very low-lying, wet, exposed environment. It's very dynamic. And so locals who live out here are quite used to living with routine flooding events, dealing with erosion, but these changes are happening at a much more frequent pace or increased pace, and it's creating more and more problems. As you can see in these pictures, this is during a high tide event, and people who live down this road oftentimes have a hard time accessing their homes. Other families are seeing their yards flood like this. The front yard of this house is actually slowly turning into hay grass, or salt marsh hay grass. I'm sorry, I don't have the right terminology there, but it's experiencing marsh encroachment. So in this graphic on the The left-hand side of your screen is a set of model projections that show you what sea level rise is anticipated to look like over the next 30 years. And you can see that by the time we get to 2050, it's projected that much of this island is going to, rather than being a peninsula, it's going to be a string of islands. These vulnerabilities these physical vulnerabilities are also being exacerbated by the fact that the Deal Island communities are aging, and they are also quite socioeconomically depressed. They're also highly rural, which means that they have a limited ability to access government resources and to participate in decision-making processes that could otherwise help them more effectively deal with these this change that they're experiencing. So in 2012, researchers from the University of Maryland, in partnership with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, developed the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership to link local and regional stakeholders together in coming up with ways to better support the local resilience of the Deal Island Peninsula. The idea behind DIP was to create a network of stakeholders who can exchange knowledge, share resources, and who can support the increased participation of locals in decision-making spaces as a way to enhance the resilience of the Deal Island Peninsula to these ongoing and future climate change impacts. We facilitate the network through a collaborative learning process, which is used to promote two-way knowledge exchange and to create more equitable participation amongst all of our stakeholders on the network. And these stakeholders include local residents and watermen, as well as environmental professionals and scientists from government, universities, and regional NGOs. And ultimately, our end goal is to enhance the resilience of both the communities and marshes out here to climate change. So I wanted to also point out that we've been doing our work through a number of different research projects, which are highlighted down here on this timeline. But the one I'm going to focus on today is the Integrated Coastal Resiliency Assessment, which we carried out between 2016 and 2018. So the ICRA was an effort to develop a collaborative process to develop a set of targeted coastal resilience projects to address key vulnerabilities on the peninsula. And we did this assessment through a three-phase approach, where we first identified a set of focus areas collaboratively with much of the identification was being led by local community members, and you can see these 4 focus areas highlighted here. We then went into these focus areas as groups and assessed the different resiliencies and vulnerabilities of these locations, and then looking across all the information that we collected through those assessments, we were able to facilitate a prioritization process to select or to identify key issues of concern and to start developing some adaptation projects. So the ICRA was also the focus of my PhD dissertation research, which sought to understand how heritage, as this cultural tool of power, was mobilized in shaping the ICRA process. So I was specifically interested in how watermen stakeholders use heritage to frame their understandings of resilience and vulnerability on Deal Island, and in what ways these narratives were ultimately used to help shape the selected adaptation approaches. So what this research revealed, which I did using an ethnographic approach, was that watermen stakeholders, and I'm including watermen themselves as well as born here's who are from watermen families, these stakeholders draw upon 3 primary narratives in interpreting climate change and in framing their resilience and vulnerability to these changes. And these narratives include narratives that are tied to the peninsula's Methodist roots, to traditions of working the water, and to a history of isolation and independence. And I'm going to explain more of these over the next few slides. So I mentioned a few slides back that Deal Islanders celebrate this area as the birthplace of Methodism on the Eastern Shore. And Methodism is a really important part of local identity out here, particularly for these waterman families. For many of them, their faith is how they navigate the world. It's how they interpret the way that the world is changing around them and how they respond to those changes. So for example, many of the born heres that were involved in the ICRA, oftentimes they use their faith to frame sea level rise and storms and flooding as part of all being a part of God's plan. So for many of these folks, they understand climate change to be this really complex phenomenon, and they struggle to understand how humans can fully understand this because we have imperfect knowledge. So in their minds, God is the only one who can fully understand what is in the future with climate change. While they value science, and they certainly rely on science to make decisions when they're working the water, for example, they also see science as an imperfect tool because it's human. So it only lets us understand climate change to a point. And as a result, they tend to be quite skeptical of these scientific projections about climate change and what this looks like, particularly in the distant future. So this isn't to say, though, that they don't think that it's important to not take actions to reduce their risk to flooding or erosion. But their attitude tends to be that you do what's humanly possible, and then the rest you really have to just trust to God. And this is a really important part of their resilience strategy, and it's one that they oftentimes feel is undervalued and dismissed by climate science. And as a result, this can be a source of tension within climate change discussions. So in addition to faith, waterman traditions also importantly frame local understandings about climate change. These traditions have taught many of these born here families how to be highly adaptable. To be a successful waterman, you have to embrace this ethic of hard work, of flexibility, and you have to be able to accumulate this rich experiential knowledge from working the water day in and day out. And they rely upon these cultural tools to navigate this highly dynamic and unpredictable environment in which they live and work. So this narrative was often drawn upon in responding to concerns about sea level rise that were being brought in by outsiders. They often use this narrative to say, hey, you know, flooding is a fact of life out here. It's something that we've always had to deal with and that we'll continue to deal with and figure out how to live with, even as sea levels are rising. And then the third narrative that I wanted to highlight is that born heres often reflect on the area's long history of isolation and framing what it means to be resilient. So they construct narratives drawing upon this history about the importance of independence, of being self-sufficient, of being resourceful. And many draw upon this history in articulating strong desires to adapt in place and to resist potential government intervention, particularly in the form of regulations. So these narratives all play a really important role in framing how many of the born here locals are understanding their resilience, but they also use it to frame their understandings of vulnerability, which many of them attribute to increasing numbers of environmental regulations that infringe on their ability to be highly adaptable and flexible. And this is nicely exemplified in a quote that was shared with us by a local waterman at one of our workshops. He shared a story beforehand about being fined what he said was $25,000 for infilling encroaching marsh grass on his property. he was putting this dirt on the edge of his property to protect his land, which is where a lot of his financial assets are embedded. And so after sharing this story, he followed it with this quote. He said, "We property owners are going to be at the end of this. We're going to be in rooms like this, asking for help, pleading for help. And yet our hands are going to be tied because there's a lot of regulations. That's what's holding us up. As property owners, there's a lot we can do, but I can't legally do it because my land is wet." So we can understand these experiences of vulnerability by looking more broadly at conflicting uses of waterman heritage in the Chesapeake Bay region. And this brings up another really important dimension of heritage, which is that heritage as a tool of change is also filled with conflict and power struggles. And while it can be a source for empowering some, depending on how it is used, it can also be wielded in ways that intentionally or unintentionally disempower others whose needs or interests don't align with particular agendas of change. So I'm going to pick on the Bay Foundation here. So apologies to anybody on the call from the Bay Foundation, but this is just a ripe example of what I mean here. So the Bay Foundation owns the skipjack, the Stanley Norman, and this used to be a working skipjack, but now it's used as an educational vessel to mobilize Chesapeake Bay restoration goals. So this icon of waterman heritage is now being used to take students out on the bay and to give them the experience of what it was like to work the water at the turn of the century, while also teaching them the dangers of over-harvesting and the importance of the ecological importance of oysters as filter feeders that ultimately need to be protected to protect the bay, or for cleaning the bay. And so what's implied in this lesson is that waterman industries are a thing of the past, and that watermen are largely to blame for the state of the bay. And while I'm sure that the CBF does not intend to marginalize watermen, these kinds of heritage deployments is what many of them point to as mechanisms that have left watermen feeling that they're being written out of a future Chesapeake Bay cultural landscape. And in particular, they point to the ways that these narratives have shifted towards a prioritization of nature over people, an emphasis on recreational values on the bay rather than thinking of the bay as a working landscape, and as prioritization, and they also point towards the prioritization of scientific over experiential knowledge. So in the context of climate change, watermen suggest that these shifts have problematically limited their ability to meaningfully participate in adaptation decision-making. They also point to these shifts as limiting resource investments in rural working landscapes to help them deal with these environmental changes. And they also point to the fact that these narratives have driven more regulations that they see as privileging ecological health over human well-being. And a great example of this can be seen in the suite of regulations that are in place to protect wetlands for their water quality benefits. And while this is certainly very important to do, and we need to protect these wetlands for their ecosystem services, with climate change, these wetlands are beginning to migrate onto private property. This means that properties are becoming these unusable, regulated spaces that property owners can't do anything about to protect. So before I move on, does anybody have any quick questions or need any clarification on anything I just explained?
I don't think we've had any questions come up yet.
Okay, sounds good. So I point out all of this to highlight that it's important to be cognizant in how we're using heritage, because it can be used in ways that can be harmful and can disenfranchise people. But what I want to focus on is the way that it can also be a tool for leveraging cultural capital to support more socially resilient communities. In particular, I see heritage as being valuable as a tool for developing meaningful connections with communities, which in doing so, we can then help to develop more culturally relevant approaches that support local needs and goals while also furthering environmental health. It's also a valuable tool in that it provides us with an approach for empowering local cultural bearers who are oftentimes local leaders in a community. And so by empowering these local leaders to be part of these conversations, you put them in a better position to begin governing their own pathways towards resilient futures. And so I want to share with you a few ways in which the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership has harnessed heritage within our various efforts, but I'm going to focus specifically on how we've done this in the ICRA process to promote socio-ecological resilience on the peninsula. So I've just got two quick examples. The first focuses on the way that the leaders of this DIP project, the ICRA, mobilized Methodist heritage to empower this faith-based knowledge that importantly grounds the communities out here. So one way we did this was that in each of the ICRA meetings, we always open these in a prayer that was led by either one of the local pastors or born here, and these were always hosted in a local church. And this went a long way to demonstrating to outsiders who are used to coming in and being the experts and facilitating sort of one-way knowledge sharing. This was a way to really create more of an equitable space here. We also, during workshop discussions, the facilitators oftentimes made a point to actively elicit faith-based perspectives, which also helped to empower these local actors to participate more in these discussions about climate change. And this was really important because these are conversations that folks that come from these more conservative faith backgrounds feel quite uncomfortable being a part of. And so by eliciting and inviting them to share their faith-based perspectives, we created a more inclusive space for them to participate. And this was really important for helping us to identify pathways forward for adaptation projects. So what this ultimately did was it shifted us away from a focus on what can we do to protect Deal Island from future sea level rise to targeting more of the immediate issues with flooding on the peninsula, which is largely driven by tidal ditch flooding onto roadways and onto properties. And so through this prioritization project or process, the Somerset County government ended up going after a grant to map out the network of ditches out here to identify where the hot spots were to help them start prioritizing their maintenance projects to better support local flooding concerns. Another way that DIP mobilized local heritage was by framing watermen and other local experts, or sorry, local stakeholders as experts here. And by doing so, we elevated the importance of their experiential knowledge to be on par with those of scientific and technical expertise that were part of these conversations. So these local experts are experts in how these local landscapes have changed over time, and they have this rich understanding of that change that was really integral in helping us to not only identify where to target, but how to shape adaptation projects so that they could be successful. So this shoreline here is one of the other big projects that came out of the ICRA process. This is a shoreline on Deal Island. And this is a photo that a local shared with us of what this shoreline looked like in 1991. This is what it looked like in 2006. And today, the strip of sand that's there is almost non-existent. So this area was identified as an important a highly vulnerable area the community wanted to target, because right behind the shoreline is a marsh complex that protects a low-lying a residential area, and then the Deal Island Road, which gives access to points further down the peninsula. And so should this shoreline breach, it has the potential to impact these residents on the interior of Deal Island, and potentially access to other areas of the peninsula. This project, by bringing local experts in, we are able to really hone in on this site that has both cultural and ecological significance. And the state of Maryland ended up selecting this site for a $1 million living shoreline project that's actually about to break ground. And they took an existing template for a living shoreline and redesigned it to incorporate local knowledge about how this shoreline has changed and how it's being impacted by wave action and storms and other factors that have driven erosion here. And so ultimately what I hope we'll see is that this living shoreline that's going in here will have much more success because of that local knowledge. And then I just have one more example here, and this is actually from one of our Chesapeake Bay, or sorry, Deal Island Peninsula partners, the Chesapeake Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve. They have a program, an educational program called Shoring Up Resilience Through Education, or SHORE. And this is a program that's aimed at investigating and building among Somerset County's youth and their families an understanding of how the environment, science, and cultural heritage can work together to build more resilient communities. And drawing upon DIP's broader use of heritage, CBNR has actually integrated heritage into this in important ways that help to hone in on particularly culturally significant sites, and to get students to think through how science can help inform ways to shore up their community and support local heritage and or cultural assets, I should say. And so one way that they've done this is by engaging with local cultural bearers. And two of those individuals are pictured here. And so these individuals really help to inform the science through storytelling. So they brought in cultural values and meanings in the stories that they were telling about how these landscapes are changing and what is at risk from a community perspective. And then the science was able to inform ideas about how to protect those community assets. And so I love this quote here. You know, science is powerful, data is powerful, but when you are able to attach that data to a good story, it becomes even more meaningful and unforgettable. So I think this is a really powerful use of heritage that CBNR has integrated into their educational programs that I was happy to share with you all today. And then just one last sort of food for thought. I wanted to share with you a new opportunity for thinking about how you might use storytelling or bring in heritage in your own work through this new app called Maryland, or My Coast Maryland. This is an app that's been launched by the Maryland Department of Natural Resources, and it's a photo documentation tool that's intended to collect crowdsourced data about local nuisance tidal flooding and storm damage to help inform decision makers, flood mitigation and flood adaptation planning and processes and projects. And you can go to this website here today and check out the website. It's very cool. If you download it on your phone, it's available for both iPhone and Android, and it's very easy to use. Basically, what it does, this screen here is what the app looks like when you pull it up on your phone. So it's got some tools that let you track how the tide might be affecting you personally, but then you can submit reports down here at the bottom. And when you submit a report, the app takes your photo and the data that's embedded in it about when the photo was taken, its location, the date, and it links that information to nearby tidal stations, stream gauges, and to weather data pulled from Dark Sky, one of the weather apps. And so in doing this, it helps to create a bigger picture of what's causing the flooding and in these local flooding conditions. So I'd like to propose to you that this could be a really neat way for engaging communities and helping them to elevate their own flood stories and to tell it in ways that make sense to them. So I challenge you to think about how you might integrate heritage into this to mobilize communities, to leverage their stories, and to improve their environmental circumstances. So just some quick concluding thoughts for you to think through why heritage matters for environmental educators. So I know environmental or educators are, of course, very attuned to developing culturally sensitive approaches. Cultural sensitivity is a critical part of what you all do. And so being able to engage your audience through a cultural heritage lens can be a really valuable way for facilitating this process. Secondly, engaging with heritage also provides an opportunity to build more meaningful and inclusive connections with communities. And this leads to much more impactful environmental educational programming because it links environmental goals to those things that people care most about, which is oftentimes the preservation of their communities and their social well-being and health. So, and then third, cultural heritage helps us to integrate critical social resilience considerations into our efforts to build coastal resilience in the Chesapeake Bay and to support a healthy and vibrant Chesapeake. So in other words, it's a way to support more holistic socio-ecological approaches for building resilience. And then finally, I think when you combine all of these factors together, it gives us a way to build more effective and sustained local engagement that ultimately can help us to support more robust and impactful outcomes. So with that, I'll leave it there. And thank you for the opportunity to present. I will say there's a lot more information on what we've done through the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership, which you can check out on this web link. And if you'd like to get in touch, feel free to email me. I'm now with the Nature Conservancy, and this is my new email address. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much. So I have two questions ready for you. The first one was just about how you first started the conversations with the community. Like you talked about, you learned how they frame their ideas around climate change, but how did you first learn that?
Yeah, so the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership, one of the co-founders of it is an anthropologist who's been working out here for a number of years, and so he had some existing connections with the community. So I think identifying first those trusted community connectors to begin these conversations is really important, and investing in time and energy and building those trusted relationships. But the way that I approached this was I did a number of interviews with folks and gave them the opportunity to really tell me their story. Why does this place, what does this place mean to them? What are they concerned about losing with environmental change? What do they understand as important assets for the community to protect, to maintain a vibrant Deal Island community center? And so these things, I didn't lead with climate change, but you know, and analyzing the data, I would oftentimes look to see how, I guess this was a number of years ago that I was doing this research. I was doing it in 2016 to 2018. And so I don't remember all the exact questions that I asked, but I did have in these interviews some specific questions about climate change, which helped me to kind of tease out how these other things that they were talking about fit with that narrative on climate change. And so I did this. I guess that answers the question. I really gave people the space to talk about what's important to them, and then linked it to climate change through that process, and really built those connections through trusted sources within the community.
Thank you. And so another question that came in was focused on, you know, you talked about how they think about science and framed around their faith. And if you saw during the course of this program, if any like perspective on climate change and maybe what they can do in response to climate change at all changed, like during the process of this program, and maybe their views also on the science?
I think I think that folks are more open to talking about climate change than perhaps they were when we first initiated the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership. And a lot of that has been facilitated by creating space for these other perspectives to be part of these conversations that we've been having. And so I think they're still quite skeptical. Many of them are still quite skeptical of climate science and, you know, how valuable it can be for thinking ahead into the future. But they're certainly much more open to talking about climate change and sea level rise, and having conversations, even if we come to the point where we agree to disagree. Having the ability to have those frank conversations and open up space to talk about it is really critical. And so I think there's an appreciation of that. I think also, you know, there's oftentimes within these communities that we're working with, certain assumptions made about government and people who work for the government or for Maryland DNR. And so while at the beginning of this process, those folks may have been sort of framed as the bad guy in the local perspective, I think by building these relationships and trusted partnerships, people have come to, you know, trust people more and respect them and rely on their insights and their perspectives and value that. And so they've come to recognize that these are people that, you know, they do want to help, and we all might be approaching this from a slightly different angle, but at the end of the day, everybody's here to support Deal Island. And so that tension that existed at the beginning maybe was eased through this process of collaborating over a number of years. And so I think that's one of the values that's really come out of this partnership.
So I think that actually answered another question that came in about just changing the relationships maybe between the community and government and science and vice versa. Then we have this question, was a common goal such as improving the fishery become a point of contention or connection between residents and government agencies?
Can you read that one more time?
Yeah, so I guess thinking about the common goal of maybe improving the fishery or the oysters, like what's happening in Deal Island, during the course of the partnership, did it become a point of contention or maybe a connection between the community and the government?
Yeah, we haven't through our work through the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership really dived very deeply into the fisheries issue. But yeah, I think people, we've been more focused on sort of onshore issues with flooding and erosion. But certainly there has been, you know, I'll give an example. So there, during the Deal Island Shoreline project that is about to break ground, when folks were talking to locals about things that could be incorporated, one of the ideas that came up was, well, maybe we could use oyster, or build new oyster reefs to help attenuate wave action. And I don't think that ultimately got integrated into the plan, but it was something that was being considered as a way to support the local fisheries and these, you know, heritage practices of working in the water, while also fortifying this natural infrastructure that importantly protects the community. So I guess, and then more broadly, again, I think people have a bit of a better understanding of these regulations that, I think from the waterman's perspective, you know, they're framing regulations oftentimes from their experience as watermen and being regulated as watermen, but also, you know, I think they've understand that these are very complex, and there's a lot of different, they operate in very different ways depending on what the issue is. And so there's an appreciation, more of an appreciation for that complexity, and better understanding of perhaps some access points for being part of those conversations, and better understanding some of the issues. Although I will say there's a lot more work to be done there in terms of helping people understand how to navigate regulations. Yeah.
Well, I mean, overall, though, it sounded like a success of at least building relationships and helping different groups talk to each other and maybe understand their perspectives.
Yeah. And a sort of related point to that, I think as we've moved along in the project, we've also come to recognize that at the local, so we've been really focused on the community end of things, but we're realizing that supporting, let me back up. So we've been really focused on driving with the community perspective, which I think is still really important to do, and we're leaning on our non-local partners to help facilitate action. But our non-local partners only have so much power within their own positions. And so now, you know, supporting socio-ecological resilience on Deal Island also necessitates us to take it to higher levels of governance, and to engage folks that shape some of the sort of political regulatory landscapes that really are importantly influencing our local capacity to support resilience.
Thank you, Liz. I definitely learned a lot just about thinking about community engagement with this. Before we run out of time, I'm actually just going to share a last screen. I have it open up here. And then after that, let's see. I'll invite people, I'll stop recording, and I'll invite people to turn on their cameras and come off mute if they'd like, and ask any more questions that you have. But just before we all leave, like I said at the beginning, this was recorded, and it will go on the Chesapeake Bay Program's YouTube page, and it'll be up probably in the next 2 weeks. And I'll make sure to share a link once I stop sharing my screen. And we just have one more upcoming MWEE Practitioner webinar coming up, and that's May 19th. And we'll be focusing on tools you can use with your students to look more at some of the data. And then you can register at the EST website, just like you did for this one. We also have a few virtual programs coming up in the summer. We have the Mid-Atlantic Climate Change Conference, Education Conference at the end of June. So this is going to be our second attempt. And we're taking proposals right now, and they're actually due at 5 p.m. on Friday. So hurry up. But if you need more time, please don't hesitate to email Elise, Bart, or I, and we can work with you. We're also offering a summer Teachers on the Estuary, and you can register now. We'll put the link in the chat. And then Elise is actually working with a colleague, Ann Strokes, and they're doing a Mid-Atlantic cohort with the Summer Institute for Climate Change Education, which is run by Climate Generation, which is out of Minnesota. So if you're interested in that, I'm going to share that link too. You can, join the cohort with them. But I'll just stop sharing my screen and stop the recording. And again, please come off mute if you have any more questions.